Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in the northern, western and eastern parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. At the same time, the Russians have managed to advance in the northern parts of the Kharkiv region, where they have crossed the border and managed to capture the town along the Uska river line. The Russians also managed to advance further westwards in the direction of Bilorivka, and in the Velika Novo-Silka direction, the Russians are storming the fortified positions northwest of the town from three separate directions. Starting out in the Kursk region, we see that the Russians have managed to capture the northern parts of the town of Pogrebki. They have managed to capture parts of the farm area as fighting continues in this direction. There's also some positional fighting here in the eastern parts of the town near Mariivka. The Russians have also managed to advance and gain a foothold within the town of Lebedivka along the Luknia river line. We are seeing a general offensive by the Russians alongside the entirety of the Luknia river line from Pogrebki in the north and all the way down to Luknia in the south. The Russian offensive operations here is to gain control over the western bank of the river line all the way to the supply line near Yunakivka and to breach it to cut off the Ukrainian forces alongside the eastern bank of it by connecting their forces in the eastern and western parts of it. However, the Ukrainians have been actively counterattacking to prevent this from happening by counterattacking both of the flanks to keep the pocket open. The Russians have therefore been attempting to align the front line with the river line prior to breaking through, and therefore we see the fighting right now being alongside the river line through Svetlikovo towards Lebedivka and then upwards towards Luknia to capture the pocket here west of Luknia, and then move onwards upwards towards Pogrebki from the southern direction alongside the river line. The Russians have also managed to recapture Cherkasskaya Konopelka here in the southeastern parts of Sutsha, where they've managed to push back the Ukrainians following their counterattack to the southeast of Sutsha. With this, the Russians have recaptured the towns that the Ukrainians managed to capture, and the fighting is now returned to the forest lines near Makhnovka, Dmitriukov, and Kulmakov, here to the north of the town. Moving on to the eastern parts of the Kharkiv region, we see that the Russians have managed to gain control of the remaining parts of Topoli, gaining control over the crossing between the Russian side and the Ukrainian side of the border here in the Kharkiv direction. And with this, we see that the Russians are moving on to create a larger bridgehead across the Uska river line. With their control over Topoli, there is no nearby significant settlements. The largest settlement nearby is Kamyanka, and the subsequent Limandruhi on the eastern bank of the river line, where the Russians could attempt to make another crossing in this direction and gain control over the roads alongside the Uska river line to create a very wide bridgehead across. We already see that they have a wide one with the Verishna as the center, but with this the Russians would be able to have a very wide bridgehead across that is connected to the Russian side of the border, and offensive operations could take place to connect it to the sites alongside the main roads and the towns here to the northwest, and a wider crossing along the border area. This could significantly improve the supply of the Russian forces in this section of the front line. Moving on further south in the direction of Bilorivka, the Russians have managed to capture fortified positions to the south of the waste heap near Bilorivka and further parts of the town itself, leaving just a small part remaining under Ukrainian control. And with this geolocated footage that was just revealed, we see that the Russians have actually managed to capture this entire area west of Bilorivka, and with this the entirety of the town is under Russian control, as well as the majority of the border area itself. This leaves only a small part of the Luhansk region remaining under Ukrainian control, and that is the Serbianki forest area. With capture of Bilorivka and the recent capture of Novo-Silka, we see that there are just a few parts of forest areas and not a single town remaining under Ukrainian control within the Luhansk region. The capture of the area near Bilorivka is several fortified positions and forest lines and forest patches alongside the town and the border area. This kicks the Ukrainians out of this frontline position, and therefore we will see the Ukrainians fall back all the way to the fortified positions near Ryorivka, as well as the fortified positions in between that and the line of defense near Siversk. This will be the main defensive positions of the Ukrainians, the fortified areas, and not the towns anymore, as they are completely destroyed, complete wrecks. And from this, we see that the Russians are slowly moving forward here in the Bielorivka direction, following their foothold in the Verkhnyo-Kamyansk direction and the capture of fortified positions there. This leaves only these small fortified positions and direct towns remaining under Ukrainian control east of the fortified positions. The Russians are unlikely to make any significant attempts to advance further westward from Bielorivka following the capture of the town. They may assault these fortified positions and take up positions there, because the nature of the defense of the Ukrainian forces in the area is that they have their fortified positions as frontline positions. The Russians storm them with armored vehicles to get to these positions and take control of them. The Ukrainians then stop those assaults with FPV drones, and following that they launch counterattacks to regain control of these areas. Based on this, we see that the way the Russians likely would look to move forward is to launch an attack towards one of these fortified positions to gain control of it. When the Ukrainians then launch a counterattack, they'll be able to use the same tactic the Ukrainians are using, stop it with FPV drones, and then have their own backup forces to advance further. The reason why it's very difficult for the Russians to advance further is because it's really just open fields. The towns are completely destroyed, which makes it extremely difficult to take up positions within them. So they have to take up positions within the fortified positions, which are also vulnerable because they have been heavily demolished. There is no well-fortified area here in between the Luhansk border area and Siversk that the Russians can pick up on. Therefore, their assault would need to reach all the way to Siversk to establish a proper position, but even there it's completely destroyed, so they have to move through the fortified positions, which are occupied by Ukrainian soldiers, and that makes it very difficult for them to gain control of it, not to mention the FPV drones and the ATGMs as well. So we have a lot of resistance by the Ukrainian forces in the fortified positions, and it makes it very difficult for the Russians to advance because of the nature of the terrain. Instead, what is more likely for the Russians to advance through is the towns to the south of Siversk, as they are less in ruins. And then there's also the canal direction, where Russians can advance alongside the canal to simply cut off the Ukrainian forces in the area. And then there's the heavy fighting taking place in the Syryanki forest area along the Syrsk-Donetsk river, where the Russians are facing a similar issue. Although it's a forest area, there's been so much fighting in the area. The forest is completely burnt down, and it's a no man's land, to be sure. The fortified positions are completely wrecked, and the forest is completely wrecked. Instead, we will see that the Russians will focus on taking control over Torske and Sarishne, and then move onwards towards Liman. And gaining control over Liman would allow the Russians to connect their forces from the south through Bakhmut along the canal, north of Chasiv Yar, towards the river line, and control over Liman in the north would cut off the Ukrainian forces in the Siversk direction. Therefore, we see that the main efforts of the Russians is currently concentrated on the Serbets river line, where the objective is to gain a bridgehead across to start attacking Liman and to advance further towards the Uskar river line. We also see that there's the advance from the north near Makivka all the way down south to Yampolivka that will soon move on towards Sarishne and Torske. And then from the southern flank, we see that the fighting is focused around Chasiv Yar to gain control of the high ground, following which the Russians can advance further to the northern direction, where we see positional fighting in the direction of Ryorivka and Orehovo-Vasilivka. In the southeastern section of the front line, we see that the Russians have managed to advance north and northwest of Velika Novo-Silka. The Russians are continuing the storming of the fortified positions directly head-on and gain control over the central parts of it. At the same time, the Russians started storming the fortified positions in the second line of defense southwest of Novochertovate and managed to gain control over the first two parts of it. With this, we see that the Russians are looking to cut off the remaining fortified positions alongside the first line of defense by flanking it and putting them in a pincer maneuver from the northern and western flanks, following which the Russians gain control over the fortified positions in the east, move alongside the fortified positions to the west to gain control over Borilatske and Privilne in these areas. You'll see heavy fighting continues here northwest of Novo-Silka, where the Ukrainian fortified positions, which are expected to show a lot more resistance and prevent a quick capture by the Russians, have managed to show that the Russians have managed to break through several of these defensive positions and gain control over several of them, which has allowed them to gain control of them at a fairly quick pace. We have seen that these offensive operations have been taking place for a couple of weeks now, and this has allowed the Russians to gain control over the majority of this area within just 12 days. We will likely see that the Russians gain control of the remaining parts within the next few days, and some Ukrainian forces will likely be encircled or forced to withdraw, from which you'll be withdrawing into open fields and be vulnerable, and the Ukrainians will take a lot of casualties from that. The Russians also managed to advance northeast of Novo-Silka, where they've managed to gain control over the fortified positions and are moving onwards towards the town of Dnipro-Energia. So we see that the Russians are moving onwards alongside the river line here, the Mokyali river line north of Novo-Silka, up towards Komar, where they'll likely look to connect with their forces in the eastern direction, where fighting is continuing over Konstantinopel, where the Russians are looking to gain control of that. Then they'll move on to Bahatir, Oderatne, and then connect near Komar, where the Russians will be attacking from the southern and eastern directions. At the same time, the Russians likely expand their offensive operations west of Andreevka as well. With the capture of the fortified positions here to the west, the Russians will also advance alongside the road there towards the fortified positions there. And with control over Komar, the Russians can flank them and pincer them from the northern and southern directions, similar to the area northwest of Novo-Silka. So it is a wider scale of the same operation that they're currently doing. From this, we are seeing that the Russians are continuing their offensive operations all across the front line, where the main focus is in the direction of Novo-Silka to reach the Dnipropetrovsk region, in the direction of the Serbets river line and the Liman direction and Siversk directions in general, the Kupiansk direction and the Orishna directions across the Usk river line, and in the Kursk region, where the Russians are looking to regain full control of the region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching the entire video and reaching the end. See you all next time, and have a great day.